Mellman, Chair of the Large-Scale Track, and welcome from Space Frontier Society of New York to ISDC 96. It's been almost 40 years since the beginning of the space age. Yes, next year is the 40th anniversary of Sputnik 1. And during that time, most space activities have been government-driven. There have been a few exceptions, like communication satellites, which very quickly went to the private sector. But for the most part, it's still government activities. However, in the last 2 years, especially with the ending of the Cold War, the governments are pulling back. Now, many National Space Society members are very happy about that. However, as we've seen in some of the programs, private industry in many cases is still reluctant to commit their capital to development projects. They still want government to finance an awful lot of these activities. The question is there certain, what kind of level of support from government is still required, what can be done privately, and what can be done, what does government have to do in areas like regulation in order to promote a space-faring civilization. We're going to have several speakers this morning, and then in the remaining time, we'll have a panel discussion. Leading off will be Alan. Alan, you want to start? Alan Ladwig, who's an Associate Administrator for Policy at NASA.
Well, we almost have the flavor here of a campus bull session with the crowd, so we could probably get into a very interactive discussion, which I think would probably be the best use of everybody's time here, and would have to be most helpful to me in terms of understanding more about what some of you all think about the whole role of government participation. So rather than get into any kind of a formal statement, because of the informal nature of what we have here this morning, what I'd rather do is just kind of go through some of the points I was going to make, and then see if we can't get some interaction going with the other panel members. If anybody needs to understand what the role of NASA is as a member of the government in space, all you have to do is check out the latest version of our strategic plan. If you haven't received a copy of it yet, you can get it off the NASA homepage, off the internet. And this is the third iteration of this plan, which is being produced as part of the requirements for the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993. And in that act, it requires all agencies, federal agencies, to submit, along with their budget, in the fall of each year, a strategic plan that lays out where the agency intends to go in the future. And you also have to turn in a performance plan that shows how are you going to measure your agency, how will you determine success, and what are the measurements you'll use. Then a year and a half later, we have to turn in a performance report that tells how well do we do at meeting the requirements of our performance plan, and if not, why not? And I believe that in the name of reinventing government, in the name of having a government that's more efficient and cost less, the objective here is that they want to get agencies more accountable, and then as these performance plans and performance reports mature in the years ahead, those agencies that do a better job at meeting their objectives would be the ones that would be rewarded a little more in the budget process. At least that's how I believe it's supposed to work in theory. And so we at NASA are paying an awful lot of attention to this whole business of performance reporting and just how do we measure success. And those of you who have followed the space program for years know that that's a very slippery business with a research and development agency. How do you really measure success of agencies that are on the cutting edge, that are doing research and technology projects that may not come into fruition or public impact for another 10, 15, 20 years? But the strategic plan lays out what we think NASA's role is as a government agency in space. It includes our vision, our mission, our goals. The difference, as this plan has been maturing before we get ready to formally submit it as part of the GPRA requirements, we've been asking for public comment on it. The biggest difference in this particular plan is that it includes a roadmap that goes out to the year 2020. Previously, the plan had been geared more at kind of a 5-year level, and Mr. Golden, the administrator of NASA, decided he wanted a longer range plan. He wanted us to look out to the 2020 horizon and then go backwards from there, where you state where your goals are in that long range time frame, and then start working backwards to see, is NASA doing the kinds of things today that are going to enable us to get to long range goals. So that's what we've done in this plan. The other big difference in it, one other thing is that we're going to start putting this out in the fall. These had been previously coming out in February, just because that's kind of how the cycle had worked out. But since they're going to have to be turned in the fall anyway, the next version will already be updated this coming September, and then our first formal report to OMB will be the fall of 1997. But the other big part in here, for those that want to understand government's role, you should pay attention to the section in the back called Strategies to Revolutionize NASA. And in there, we've laid out some principles that were actually kind of developed by the administrator himself. And he is, you all by now must be familiar with Dan Golden's philosophy of faster, better, cheaper. It's our mantra around NASA. And he has really been pushing hard over the last 4 years he's been there to make this part of the way that it's more than just a slogan, it's the way NASA does business. So with that philosophy in mind, let me just check off the key points of what these strategies to revolutionize NASA are. And I would be very curious to get any kind of feedback as we go on in terms of, do you think these are real strategies or just so much government bureaucratic hyperbole? We think we have the actual things to back this up. But again, one of Dan's other big points is we want to hear back from the public about how well are we doing, and in fact, does the public see results from what we say we're doing. So number one, he wants to revolutionize NASA and the way we implement our programs more efficiently to meet customer needs. The strategic plan is all about how do our 5 enterprises, Mission Planet Earth, Aeronautics, Human Exploration Development Space, Space Technology, and Space Science, how do those meet the needs of the external community that relies on the services and technologies that NASA produces? As part of that, we're moving program management out of headquarters out to the 10 field centers around the country. We're having a much streamlined headquarters agency, which, by the way, isn't just something NASA's doing, but part of the Clinton administration reinventing government. They've asked all federal agencies to cut their headquarters by 50%. And NASA had already been on a track to do that by the year 2000. And then about a month ago, there had been kind of a change of philosophy that we could do even a bigger cut than that 50%, which got the attention of a lot of people at headquarters, I must say. So we're on a track now that could get headquarters from a high in 1993 of 2,000. We're at about 1,400 now. We thought we were going to about 1,000. And then within the last month, we've learned that the new target might be as low as 700. So there's a lot of focused attention going on at NASA headquarters right now. It's kind of like what the science advisor Jack Gibbons says, there's nothing like a hanging in the morning to focus the mind. So everybody at headquarters is very focused right now. Secondly, we want to return NASA to being a premier research and development agency. And I think this is probably the key strategy that is relevant to what I always hear when I come to the Space Society forums that seems to be most on the minds of your membership. And that is, you'd like to see NASA get out of the operations business, you'd like to see the commercial sector pick up some of those responsibilities and have NASA stay in research and development. And in fact, that's the track we're on. Mr. Golden is adamant that we're going to get NASA focused back on R&D, and we have a scaled program or phase program to start gradually pushing operations functions, transferring those to the private sector. We've started that with the Space Shuttle program where we're consolidating contracts. There's this new company that's been set up, the United States Alliance? Space Alliance. We have too many acronyms, I always forget what they stand for. So they're set up to gradually start taking over those responsibilities. The phase program laid out so that we don't forget the number one priority of NASA. And the only time you'll ever hear senior NASA management talk about a single priority, that is shuttle safety. So as we make that transition, we want to make sure we have shuttle safety, but that's going to be a big step by transferring those operations outside of NASA because that's a huge impact on the budget right now. We're also next going to be looking at the area of space communications. How do you start phasing those aspects over to the private sector? And then you'll hear later today when Bill Claybaugh speaks about reusable launch vehicles, how we're starting to thinking about operations at the very beginning of the development of these programs. With the reusable launch vehicle program, we're in partnership with industry, where we're working on the cutting-edge, long lead technologies per their request, and the whole program is set up that it will be operated by the private sector when it becomes into fruition. So those are the types of things we're doing there to get the public sector more involved. And that follows on that we will do only those things no one else can do. So if we find functions that can be done elsewhere or more efficiently, perhaps from either another government agency or outside the government agency, we'll get out of that business. And I know that this is an area that's on a lot of people's mind that are big promoters of space commercialization, that they think, in fact, NASA is not moving fast enough. I would only remind you that it does take some time to change a large bureaucracy. We're not going to make these changes overnight, but I would like to think we're on the right track. We're eliminating duplication and consolidating. This has been especially true out in our research centers, where when we had the bigger budgets in the earlier days of the agency, we could afford some redundancy and duplication and competition among our field centers, but we just don't have that budget anymore. The one chart that ought to be emblazed in everybody's mind is the kind of 5-year outlook budget chart, where it shows that back in '91, we had a budget track that looked like it was going to go out to the year 2000 and hit about $38 billion a year. Well, needless to say, that ain't going to happen. And the track looks much more like we're going to hit, if we can maintain $13 billion, we'd be probably happy. And I've seen figures that it can go as low as 11. And this is all part of the entire federal deficit reduction. It's not just aimed at NASA, it's all federal agencies are hitting this area. We've been instructed, our FY97 request is 13.8. We are asking for stability in our budget process. We felt we got it last year with our budget. We're asking for it again this year so that we can institute and implement all these radical reinvention activities that have been going on so that we can in fact have an agency that does do things in a new way. But you have to have the budget stability in order to make that happen. You can't keep jerking our budget around and making us readjust all of our programs and planning and schedules, because that's not an efficient way to do business. So 13.8 is the magic number if anybody knows what they want to go and support us on, and that's the direction we want to go. We're changing the way we work with our contractors. I'm not going to dwell on that one very much, but it just has to do with a lot of procurement initiatives that are going on. It is certainly no secret that government has not always been the most efficient when it comes to contract management and the way we set up contracts. So there's an entire array of procurement initiatives, and we can get that information to you. You can probably get it off the NASA homepage under the Office of Procurement for those of you that are procurement junkies, which I can't imagine why anybody's going to do that. We want to change regulations so that we can do business differently. Part of the deal of reinventing government is that then you still run into certain regulations that are out there that weren't necessarily developed by NASA, that have been laid upon us by Congress or other regulatory agencies. So we have to work to make sure that we don't have too many policies or regulations that affect how we do business. So we've been ordered to cut back on our regulations by documentation by 50%. And that exercise is going on. We want to collaborate with old and new partners. We're trying to look for new partnerships with industry. I think you'll hear more, as I said, from Bill this afternoon about the reusable launch vehicle, how that's kind of a new partnership. We're doing a lot more with other agencies like FAA and the Aeronautics Enterprise, DOD on a wide range of activities. Now that we cooperate with the Russians, we're trying to cooperate more with DOD. And so there's all kinds of things going there. We're going to measure performance and communicate our results, demonstrating our relevance and contributions to national needs. This is a very important one. The performance part gets to what I already mentioned, the performance plan. And we have had one internal pilot project on performance plans at both the enterprise level and the agency level. We're getting ready to publish a second version, and we're going to make sure that's on the Office of Policy and Plans homepage, and we'd really like to hear back from people on that. Have we found the right performance measurements. But the other part of that statement is and communicate our results. And I know that this is one the Space Society is especially interested in. Because we do all these things, we think we're doing good things for this nation with the Space and Aeronautics program, but when you see different public opinion surveys, they come up with results that say, well, the public really doesn't quite understand what NASA does and why it's doing it. There seems to be so much emphasis on the launch, on the landing, and there's not much emphasis on the results, on what they're doing while they're up there. I think that's getting a little better on shuttle missions, but we have to do a better job. Once we generate knowledge, how do we communicate knowledge? So we have a new, what we call a cross-cutting process team that my office is heading up, and we're taking a look at how do we communicate knowledge across the agency. What is the process we use, and how can we improve that? And we're going to try to have that be in sync with a new initiative that the NASA Advisory Council is doing, that Laur is heading up a committee that's looking at how we communicate as well. So we'll have the advisory committee working from an external view on this. We'll have the NASA team looking at it internally, and I'm quite excited about the synergy we might have between those two efforts. Finally, we're going to deliver on our commitments to be accountable for the success of our programs and provide a balanced and stable aeronautics and space program, implementing strategic management throughout NASA. And I think the biggest reason you have seen a turnaround in political support for NASA over the last 3 years is because of the first part of that sentence. We're going to deliver on our commitments. If you'll recall, back in 1993, the House Appropriations vote that we always refer to as kind of the space station vote, although it involved more than just station, we only won that vote by that budget that year by 1 vote. And then that set up the danger signal that, you know, something was amiss in our communication with Congress. So Mr. Golden had a proactive effort of educating Congress, working with Congress to get them to understand our strategic plan, what we were trying to do to revolutionize the agency, and start doing the things he said we were going to do. So that each year he could go back and said, here's what I promised you last year, here's what we're going to accomplish, and then here's how we did. The result of that was the next year the vote was 125 to the plus. The next year was, I think it was 165 or maybe 168 to the plus, and now we're geared up for the next round of those votes this year, and we think we're still on the right track there. So those are the important strategies to revolutionize NASA. Those are the way we're trying to implement what we believe our government role is. There's one other piece that goes with this. It's kind of like, okay, what else then within these enterprises, within these activities, what is the government's role? And Mr. Golden has been testing a new theme, if you will, and that's what we call the Origins program. And we think that this really gives some definition to NASA and provides a unique role that only the government can do. That we don't see how the commercial sector or private industry is really going to pick this one up as a driver of something they're going to be able to make a profit off of. And that has to do with seeking to understand our origins and the laws of nature. That we want to develop tools and knowledge to help preserve our freedom and provide hope and opportunity for our children. To achieve these goals, we want to ask the following questions. How did galaxies, stars, and solar systems and planetary bodies of all kinds form and evolve? So we want to more deeply explore this question by understanding the processes associated with these transformations, measuring the parameters that define our universe, its size, age, shape, and composition. Secondly, the next question we're going to ask is life of any form, however lowly or complex, carbon-based or other, unique to planet Earth? And I think you've heard about some of these discoveries from the Hubble lately, where they're finding planet-like bodies in other solar systems with the potential of elements of life that might be there. Third, by looking out at our planetary bodies and down at our own planet, can we develop predictive environmental climate, natural disaster, resource identification, and resource management models to help ensure sustainable development and a high quality of life? So that's kind of bringing in the Mission to Planet Earth enterprise and having that be in sync and have some synergy with the space science enterprise. Fourth, can we develop the aviation technology that provides fast, affordable, and safe transportation to enrich the culture and economic lives of all the world's people while preserving the environment and assuring enhanced global security. This brings in the aeronautics enterprise to this whole theme. Fifth, we need to develop affordable tools to answer the previous questions. How can we improve the safety, affordability, maneuverability, comfort, speed, and reduce the environmental impact of traveling through air and space? Secondly, what cutting-edge process, technologies, and techniques must be developed to enable answering all these questions in the most productive, affordable, timely manner? Third, how can we most effectively transfer the knowledge we gain from our discoveries to commercial ventures in space, air, and our own planet? The sixth question is, how do we most effectively communicate the knowledge we gain to the American people to educate them and provide commercial opportunities? So once again, the communication theme is big on our minds. By the way, the other thing those surveys always tell you is once the public does understand what we're doing, the more they understand the reason of our existence, then they're very supportive of what we're doing. The only negative that this one survey found, this was the one that's financed by Rockwell every couple of years and conducted by the Yankovic Group, was that there was a misperception about the size of NASA's budget. People think NASA spends a lot more money than it does. They think we're right up there next to Health and Human Resources and the Department of Defense. And as you all know, Health and Human Resources is above the 200 billion mark, and DoD is around 230 billion, and we're sitting here at 13.8. So in a way, I guess we should be complimented that they think that we have so much, the returns of what they're seeing is proportionate to this huge amount of money that other people get, but that ain't the case. Then when they understand how much we actually spend, and then how little, I should say how little we get, because 13 billion is a lot of money. But when they see what we have, then they think, oh, well, that's a good amount of money, or actually you should give more. But they certainly don't come back and say, well, you ought to get less. And lastly, how can we bring new understanding among the nations of the world and improve the productivity of the space program through international cooperation, yet how do we protect high-priority American interests at the same time? So this is the kind of the new theme that is referred to as the Origins program. The challenge for my office now is to try to figure out in our policy and plans activities, how do we integrate this kind of Origins theme within the existing NASA strategic plan, and where does it fit in our hierarchy of mission, goals at the agency level and goals at the enterprise level. We don't want to start confusing people that, well, we've got all these goals in the strategic plan, and now here's another set of goals that we're calling the Origins program. So Dan has asked us to integrate them together, and this Origins isn't a new set of goals, it's a way to try to articulate what we're doing to the public in a more efficient manner. I think I'll just close by mentioning that we can't forget that NASA doesn't operate in isolation. We're part of the bigger federal R&D picture, and what goes on in our agency, what we're able to do is kind of directed by this larger view of what should the federal role not just be in space, but in R&D in general. And there's a lot of debate about, well, should the government even be in the area of applied R&D? Should they just stick with basic R&D? So very soon, I would say within the next few weeks or so, there's going to be a new report come out of this administration called Technology for Technology of the National Interest. It's kind of a companion piece to Science of the National Interest that came out about 2 years ago. And this is going to try to kind of lay forth what the Clinton administration feels is the right role for government. There's 5 goals of the President's technology policy. That's to create a business environment in which the innovative and competitive efforts of the private sector can flourish. This includes eliminating unnecessary legal, regulatory, and economic barriers to the development and commercialization of new technologies. NASA certainly has a role in that. Secondly, the federal government must encourage development, commercialization, and use of technology. That we must invest in pre-competitive commercial development of technologies that offer large economic and social returns to the nation. Third, the federal government must invest in a world-class infrastructure for the 21st century to support U.S. industry and promote commerce just as it has for more than a century in agriculture, canals, rail transportation, aviation, and the national highway system. And there we want to ensure the availability of efficient, high-performance transportation infrastructure. And the federal government will encourage the adoption of new information technologies that would help government deliver services and meet responsibilities in transportation, public health, education, libraries, and other fields. And NASA's played a big role in the latter part of that, this whole business development of the national information infrastructure. Next, U.S. policy must seek to integrate the military and commercial industrial bases into a single base capability of meeting both defense and civil technology requirements cost effectively and efficiently. And that just means with the end of the Cold War, we can't afford to have two separate industrial bases, and that we have to, we want to start trying to have dual-use technologies between the defense base and the civilian base. And finally, we must develop a world-class workforce capable of participating in a rapidly changing knowledge-based economy, and that's going to have a lot to do with things like education, technologies, information systems that NASA is so involved in. So we think NASA plays a very large role in these national technology goals that this administration has laid out. I would summarize by saying that, what is the role of NASA in the future of the space program? It is certainly not an either-or. It's not that the government is ever going to get out of this stuff. I think that's foolhardy to ever believe that the private sector is going to pick up and carry us forward in all this stuff. Of course, the answer is going to be a balance between government doing what it does best, the focus on the long lead, high-risk technologies that industry can't afford or isn't willing to invest in today. It's developing the new partnerships that are going to enable a greater synergy of effort from all of our investments that we're making in this area. And it's going to be to make sure that the government provides, and NASA's not necessarily involved in this part, but providing the right kinds of incentives and regulatory environment that's going to allow the government, allow the private sector to go out and truly make what was once called the new ocean of space something more than NASA's private lane. So thank you very much.
Our next speaker is going to be Mark Hopkins. Mark is the head of Space Cause and vice president of the National Space Society.
Well, that's going to be a real tough act to follow. What I'm going to do is take a much different approach than the previous speaker, and I'm going to try to address the question of how government can be sort of better at promoting a spacefaring civilization. What can government do to promote a spacefaring civilization, which was the original question that we were asked to do. And rather than talk about space clouds at great length or something like that, which occurred to me as a possibility, I'm going to try to really focus on that question and make some comments with regard to that. And I'm going to back away from sort of two obvious, there's a couple obvious things. For example, assuming that government is not pathological and really stupid, spending more money on space is going to help us as compared to less. And there are people in society who have commented that maybe the government is pathological. But I think that it's pretty obvious, particularly given the previous speaker, that under this administration, with this administrator, not to mention Alan himself, that's not the case, at least in the vast majority of instances. And where there may have been problems in the past, there is now a great deal of effort to change that. And so I'm going to comment further on that. There's also a few obvious things that the government can do, which have been commented on many occasions in the past by society members, and were commented to some extent by Alan, such as obviously getting rid of foolish regulations. There's been talk of prizes, such as the X Prize, which has come to fruition, started to come to fruition recently, which is a prize that's given for sort of like the aviation prizes in the past, like Spirit of St. Louis that flew across the Atlantic, that did that because of a prize, and using that as sort of a motivational tool. I'm not going to talk about that either. Well, I've already spent a lot of time talking about it. Another possibility, which I'm not going to talk about, is tax incentives. Congressman Walker who's chair of the science committee, has been pushing that as a possibility. There is a serious issue in my mind as to, if you took an analysis of sort of the marginal value of the dollar. With an extra dollar given to NASA, be spent more efficiently than taking a $1 reduction in the amount of revenue the government does, assuming that this $1 reduction was set up as some sort of tax incentive to promote private enterprise, which is an interesting issue. Okay, now that I've talked about stuff I'm not going to talk about, let me bring forward a number of points which I think are somewhat different than what's normally talked about. I think it would be very useful if people in NASA believed in the mission. There are a lot of people in NASA that really are dedicated to the NASA mission in general, or at least to their specific technical areas. But there are a remarkable number of people that aren't. And this is not just true in NASA, it's also true, even perhaps more so, in the aerospace industry. One of the things I remember, which really sort of shocked me at the time, when I was growing up, I was involved in Space Scouts, which was an explorer type post activity. This was in California, and our sponsoring agency was TRW. And you know, I was just gung-ho on space, and I assumed that the most wonderful job in the world you could possibly get would be to work at some aerospace company working on space. And I discovered, much to my surprise, that a large fraction of those people just thought it was a normal job. And, you know, that's what you do, and nothing special about it or anything like that. I think one of the things that we should do, and it's not just NASA or the aerospace industry, but sort of the space community as a whole, is try to find people that really believe in what we are all about, really believe in the space variable civilization. Sort of like Ladwig, because I know that he came up through the activist movement and really believes in this stuff. And promote them, not just the only reason to promote them, but this should be a factor in moving them into important positions within the community as a whole. And I think that if you have more of those sort of people in the right positions, then everything else being equal, we will advance faster towards our goal. Another thing is, I think that the community as a whole, and maybe this is more directed at NASA, should look at compare how they do things as compared to some of the other agencies in Washington, particularly in sort of a political sense. NASA is now much, much better at this than it used to be, say, before Golden came along. It used to be incredibly bad. But I think that there is still room for improvement. And if you look at, say, how the agriculture, sort of the community that's based around agriculture does business in a political sense, and sort of the community based around interests with regards to Israel does business. I think that for the given level of resources, they are sort of better and politically organized and more sophisticated, and are more likely, everything else being equal, and for a given level of resources, to move forward. And they do sort of things like this. There's this concept of iron triangle in Washington. What this is for given interest groups, say agriculture, you'll have farmers, you'll have the agricultural business, and you'll have the government, and they all interact with one another, support one another. In our case, we would have, say, the space movement, which is a lot of citizens which are interested in space because they believe in it. You would also have the government, and you would have the private enterprise, the aerospace corporation. Now, there's a lot of interaction now between the aerospace corporations and the government. Relatively little interaction between the space movement and these other two entities. And what they do in other groups, I mean, an excellent example really is, say, the environmental movement. In the case of the environmental movement, when, say, a new Democratic administration comes to town and they're looking for people to appoint to top government positions, one of the things they do is they look for people who are in the top positions in some of the environmental groups around the country. And they bring some of these in. Not everybody, but some of these in, because they, as a consequence, first of all, they know that these people are going to believe in the mission. government agencies, which makes them all more effective and work them together, and the whole relationship becomes stronger. And this greatly improves the effectiveness in Washington of the whole environmental core group. And of course, this is great for those politicians in Washington who are also pro-environment, etc. We can do more of that. We can do very little with that. And just work on building that triangle. There's also a large number of allies, and I know Alan is already very much familiar with this, but I don't think it's penetrated the space community as a whole as much as it should. There's a large number of allies out there who are pro-space, and we're not really brought into this structure or community in some sense, which would support us politically in Washington. I mean, besides the obvious ones like everybody's going to consider, there's like science fiction fans, there's astronomy fans, there's people who are editors of science fiction magazines who love to do stuff in the space program, and they do on occasion, but it's not in any sense working on it. There's popular science magazines like Popular Mechanics or Discovery magazine, for example, and they're not tied into the community either. And then there's a large numbers of people who are pro-space, some of which are already in the movement, but a lot of which aren't. If you just sort of hold a lot of these assets together in a way which is politically effective, which doesn't involve doing anything more than is what been frequently done in the past with regard to other interest groups. As a result, we would have a lot more clout in Washington and be a lot better, everything else being equal, at moving us towards our goal of spacefaring civilization. Another thing, and again, I want to commend Alan on this, because it's really his office which has started doing this in a big way. But again, I think we need to move further in that direction. Probably it's more money for Alan. But, and that is sort of broad-based and long-run thinking, which we think would be one of the fortes of NASA in the space program. But in the past, we compared to other agencies, it really hasn't been. Like, I was in the RAND Corporation, which is a think tank. We used to get contracts with the Air Force all the time to do broad-based, long-range thinking. And we never get any contracts like that from NASA because NASA hardly ever let out any such contracts. And when they did, they would be really technical-based trade-off studies or something like that. But the Air Force is, some of the ideas that we constantly have within the space community, for example, are questions. For example, what should we do after the space station? Should we moon, should we Mars, should we asteroids? What's next big program? If this was an Air Force issue, they would already have a table full of studies from RAND Corporation and other organizations about this question, looking at it not just from the technical viewpoint, and all that's important, obviously. You have technical trade-off studies, but every other way you possibly think. And you don't. There are maybe 30 to 50 people in this country that worry about such things in any serious fashion, and most of them do in their free time and go to these other conferences and talk to one another. And in the case of, say, the Air Force, it's just a much bigger deal trying to figure out the sort of optimal thing to do in the future. And they spend, it's just, as a consequence, they'll probably do a better job of it. At least I hope to think so when I put on my next ranking. Now, part of that is obviously the strategic plan, which is, a new concept to something like this. But it's more than just having a strategic plan. We have to actually implement it. And we also have to figure out what are the sort of best things to do in your strategic plan. And this involves, if you look at other agencies, much higher level of sophistication analysis than is done in NASA. But again, it's vastly improved compared to what it used to be. Another thing, which is frequently done with regards to other agencies, which I don't think is done very much with NASA, again, Air Force being an example, is international comparisons. The Air Force is constantly looking at the Air Forces of other countries and saying, well, what are they doing? Why is it better? Why is it worse? And how can we use that knowledge to improve our situation back here? And NASA does that could, for example, look at the old Russian program, the new Russian program, for which now you've got actually access to real data, and not to mention the European, the Japanese program. Ask questions: are they more efficient? Why are they more efficient, or are they less efficient? What areas do they do better? The Air Force has done this to a certain extent. For example, one of the projects that I was involved in is we looked at the development of launch systems in Europe as compared to the United States. We looked at Ariane, and we looked at the one that came before that in Europe, which was Eldo. Compared that to the U.S. and looked at all the various comparisons, etc. That sort of thing is not done as much within NASA as I think if it was. You would get a level of decision making which was a lot better. Okay, so let me just sum up a number of these ideas, which are sort of a grab bag of ideas that I have on how we could be more efficient and effective as a community in moving towards our long-range goals. And these are basically look for people that really believe in what we're trying to do and promote them into appropriate positions. Look at how other organizations in Washington or other sort of communities are politically effective. Compare that to what we are in the space community and see what improvements can be made. Look at, in particular, look at work to develop more of this Iron Triangle, to work to develop more of the space movement and the interaction between the space movement and other elements of the community in Washington, such as politics and aerospace community, and do some more sort of long-run thinking and sophisticated analysis. One point on that, I've always been interested in, or thought it a bit strange that when somebody is doing a space project, okay, they're really, really focused on, say, developing a piece of technology or not developing a piece of technology, if that's a good idea for that particular project. And if you look at it from the viewpoint of the spacefaring civilization as a whole, maybe the greatest thing in the world to develop that, a new type of technology, maybe not for that project, but when you look at its impact on projects across the whole agency or the whole effort, it might make a lot more sense. Those sorts of ideas, I think, need to be addressed more seriously. And then again, international comparisons.
Our next speaker is Chuck Laur, who is a real estate developer and also the originator of many interesting ideas for getting private enterprise into space.
Can everybody hear me okay? The point that I'm bringing to this is a little different from the normal get government out of the way, there's too much government involvement. For a lot of the large-scale commercial projects, in effect, there is not enough government right now. You look at things like this, you look at stuff that in 15 or 20 years, realistic, credible space tourism, commercial space activity involving people living, working, playing, creating in orbit, starting in LEO and working out from there. And everybody in this room, I'm assuming, is thinking, yeah, this is obvious. This is going to happen. There's not a question in anybody's mind that we're going to be able to do this. There is a complete disconnect between that gut feel of, yeah, this is going to happen, we're going to use the station, we're going to take that technology and do commercial things with it, and the realities of how you actually do commercial things. And in that sense, the role of government is to provide a reasonable regulatory environment in order to make this stuff happen in the private sector. For instance, you assume that something like this is privately owned and operated for a profit. Just the legal issues of how do you own something in orbit are not completely worked out yet. Here you have things called titles. You have deeds. in a space environment, trying to tie a legal description to a specific orbit seems to me to be a total nonsensical thing to do, because if you need to describe exactly what it is that the people you're borrowing the money from have as their mortgage rights, you need to be able to describe that legally. To describe it by an orbit means that if it goes up and down because the solar wind kicks up, do you lose your claim to title? So what we're thinking is that you need to have the legal description more like vehicles, where you have an ID number either for the whole thing or for individual components of it, and you have the numbering system based on things more like airplanes, cars, boats, ships, whatever. You then need to have something, an office, a public office, whereby title and lien holder interest can be recorded. When you buy, say you put a group together, you buy this building, you put your $50 million down, you close at the table, you don't officially own that until you trot it down to the county courthouse and record it. Make constructive public notice that there in fact is a change in title. And there's currently nothing to do that in space assets. That is an obvious federal role, because it would seem silly to try and do that on a state-by-state basis. It also seems to me to be going too far the other way to try and set all this stuff up through the United Nations right now. The intermediate point, the logical point with the U.S. as a leader in commercial space development, is to set up federal operations that can allow you to do basic things like buying and selling commercial space infrastructure. You need to have recordable assets, and you need to be able to take the basic buy-sell finance transactions and turn them into something that the people and the lawyers understand. Maybe I made a distinction there, I shouldn't have. The other thing that you need to look at is what sort of innkeeper statutes you need. If you close your hotel door in here, there's this little placard on the back that says somebody breaks into your room and cleans you out, it's not our fault. And that if you skip town, they can go after you and get paid. Those are state laws that are passed that allow this type of business to take place. There's nothing like that in space right now, and because it is a much more dangerous type of thing to do this, or presumably, than it is to check into this hotel room, the waiver of liability issue needs to be addressed in this regard in the same way it does for the X Prize and everything else. I mean, 2 weeks ago, a dozen people got killed on Everest. My assumption is that the trekking companies that bring those people to Everest make those people sign away their souls, because you can't reliably predict when that blizzard's going to come up and kill you off. I don't know specifically anybody that is in that kind of adventure tourism business would have a lot of input. The regulatory theory, you need to have the ability to establish a set of safety rules and have an agency that adopts those, that they're out there and they're billable for everybody to use. A tourist coming in has got to have a clearly understood set of safety rules, like when you get on the airplane, you get your 30-second briefing. When you get on a cruise ship, you have your little evacuation drill. There needs to be the same level of routine stuff for tourists. There needs to be a higher level of training and certification for the people that are up here on their 3 to 6 month rotations, where they actually have some responsibility on running the shop. And ideally, you need to be able to establish a regime whereby the layman tourists that are spending big bucks to come up here can put on a suit and go EVA. If I'm spending $250,000 or $500,000 for a space vacation, I am going to be real insistent that I get the ultimate space experience, which is to get into a suit and go outside. The people that do that would probably go screaming from the room if you say, what? You're going to try and take a week of training and go out there? We train years for this type of stuff. But you need to get to that level of routine operations if you're going to get to a broad-ranging commercial environment. And you ultimately need some sort of work rules there. I mean, we joke about OSHA in space, but it's not a completely irrelevant issue. We need to have that type of rules. There also needs to be something in terms of behavior rules. Are you going to have gambling up here? You know, cruise ships leave the dock and the casinos go on. If you're an Indian tribe, you can set up a casino anywhere you want. If you're not, you have to go to your state and get a license. What are the rules about alcohol and drug use? Is this going to be like Saudi Arabia or like Amsterdam? You know, I mean, if those are the two ends of the spectrum. Where is the regulatory continuum, and who makes those decisions? You have various standards of dress and personal hygiene in various parts of the world. My understanding is that on the shuttle and on Mir, there is a significant odor problem that is resolved by getting used to it and being so congested you can't smell anything anyway. But if one culture only takes a bath once a week and another culture takes a shower every morning, you know, how are you going to try and make it friendly for both ends of that spectrum to operate in a commercial environment? I mean, there are a lot of issues regarding people in space that are just not addressed right now because there are so few people in space that you just kind of work it out on a consensus basis. When you're dealing with doing things in space, there needs to be very clear secrecy and intellectual property rules about how you take care of the people that are investing their money, presumably to make a profit in doing so. If you're doing zero-G sports in here and you're taking your feed down and selling it to ESPN, how do you protect yourself from somebody intercepting your signal? When you in private sector involves financing. Financing involves the IRS. It involves a lot of things that are fairly mundane and non-technical. For instance, is this real estate or is this personal property? One of the papers that I published makes a case that even though something like this may be as tall as a 25-story building, for tax purposes, it should be treated as personal property. It should be more like a cruise ship or an oil platform than a building. Part of the reason for that is because those type of assets are written off over 5 years as opposed to 39.5 years. Makes a huge difference in your return on investment, what depreciation period you take it over, and there is no clear ruling on that yet. If we don't have mortgages, we have the alternate is called Uniform Commercial Code for purchasing personal property. That model needs to be extended, and the registration system so that the people that are putting up the money, it's there, it protects the leasehold interest, it protects the financing interest, it protects the ownership interest. Part of the reason that you can buy and sell buildings like this for transaction costs that are a few points is because all of that regulatory regime is in place. The lenders know that they can go into civil court and have a judge sign a piece of paper that takes that title away from the guy that borrows the money and gives it to them. And until you can satisfy the lawyers for the lenders and the investment underwriters that they have those rights, that you will not get the money. You may get interest, but you will not close until all of these issues can be judged and you have a court of jurisdiction that can take something away from somebody else. Since physical repossession is not completely practical in this case because it would cost you more money to take it down and up, the alternate method of securing financing transactions is to have a lockbox mechanism where the money going in and out of this physically does not go up and down, and the lenders that are securing their assets have the ability to glom onto the cash flow from these industrial tenants, from these tourist operations, and from the check that ESPN writes you for the zero-G sports, and they can get their hands on the money without having to physically get their hands on the assets. The last thing is trying to develop some sort of a reasonable set of building codes about what you can do on this. My basic thesis here is that using station technology in a commercial sense is a generally good thing. And part of the reason that building costs terrestrially are generally affordable is because there's a known code book that everybody can design to, and you're not designing from scratch for every particular piece of flight hardware, and you've got to go through flight qual, which means spend gobs of money to take that door and bust it and test it and look at what's going on, and then design another one and bring that back and test it, and then finally the third or fourth article is actually the one that flies. With a uniform building code and operating procedures for fire protection, emergency egress, ventilation, all of those types of things, the cost of space construction can come down. We talked about this a few weeks ago at the Space Horizons conference in Boston and had zero consensus about where should this building code spectrum from. My point is that NASA's already developed all this stuff. If you just do things the way they're doing it, it's going to end up being less costly. The NASA guys in the room completely disagreed with that, and so we're in the middle of a dialogue right now. But no, you really don't want to do business like we do. And so, well, you know, maybe there's something in between. And what we came up with was the idea of trying to build some sort of a working group, probably through the AIAA, that will start to develop those standards and codes, construction codes, operating codes, assembly sequences, the types of things that are done through actually nonprofit organizations. The BOCA code is what I use, which stands for Building Officials and Code Administrators. What that is it's a committee of local building officials, industry folks, the American Institute of Architects, the Construction Trades Association. They form a committee. That committee effectively publishes a book which has no legal standing in and of itself. The local units of government that issue building permits and control codes then adopt that book and say, all right, in our jurisdiction, this is our rule book. So there is a government action to make a legal statement that this is the code. There's also an industry trade group that says this is a reasonable set of codes. None of that stuff exists at this point, and if anything like large-scale, human-occupied commercial space structures are ever to exist, it needs to happen, because otherwise you'll never get there. There needs to be regulatory things about medical capability, emergency evacuation, procedures for pressure loss, because it has a big impact on the operating procedures. This one shows evacuation capability for 9 people right now with modified Soyuz capsules. If a code requirement is that 36 people that are living and working and playing down in here all have to be evacuated on 5 minutes notice at any given time, it means not only do you have to spend $1 billion on the vehicle, but you have, or on the system, but you have to keep a $1 billion vehicle on station all the time to pull all those people out. It's like taking the 747 to Hawaii and leaving it on the tarmac, well, for the 2 weeks while those 400 people are there. It's obviously nonsensical in a terrestrial sense. My suspicion is that when you actually get into this, somebody's going to insist that that be the case. If you have a big, redundant, well-designed system, my feeling is that you don't need to have that 100% evacuation capability, that you can have survival area in depth. You're dealing with weekly service anyway. If you can medically evacuate somebody quickly and then look at 3 to 5 days of roughing it until the vehicle comes up, that will make it a lot easier to make money in this stuff, and that's really what it's all about. Commercial space is about making money and making lots of it, because right now the only people that are making money in space are in the photon moving business. To get people and things making money in space, you need to have this whole rule book of how do you do it, what are the known standards that everybody has to live with, and that is a government role. There's nobody else that can do it, and my feeling is that that is an appropriate federal government role, and that we need to start bringing these issues up, developing model codes and operating procedures, and putting them into place earlier rather than later. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Robert Zubrin, who's the chairman of the Executive Committee of the National Space Society Board of Directors and the originator of numerous innovative ideas on developing space.
These are going to be somewhat impromptu remarks, seeing as I was only informed 1.5 minutes ago that I was a participant in this panel. So, that's it. This is a panel, as I understand it, on the role of government in the space program. Is that correct?
Sure.
All right, so I'll deal with that subject. Up till the present time, the United States space program, as I think everyone knows, has been almost entirely a government enterprise. In that context, it's had a number of noteworthy accomplishments that we can all be extremely proud of, the Apollo, the various planetary probes, Viking, Voyager, and so forth. It's also had a number of problems that can be credited in part, but not in entirety, to bureaucratic inertia. There's also a very significant issue of lack of funds. This situation has caused many to point out that there's possibly a very significant role for private enterprise in promoting the exploration and development of space that has not been adequately exploited. And indeed, if you look at the history of human exploration of the Earth, while government exploration programs have played a significant role, in fact, the dominant role has been played by privately funded exploration programs. This includes, most emphatically, those programs in the great age of exploration. For example, many people are not aware of the fact that Christopher Columbus's mission, for example, was not actually a government-sponsored mission. Christopher Columbus's mission was a privately funded mission in which one of the investors, a minority investor incidentally, was Queen Isabella. Columbus had a consortium of financial backers of his own. He had a 1/8 share in the mission return. Then most notably, Bank of Santa Angle was the primary sponsor of the mission, and also the Pinzon brothers. The prize, in this case, was trading concessions. In return for doing this voyage, the Spanish government would give trading monopolies to the investors in proportion to their financial share in the mission. Now, Isabella was significant both as a one-quarter investor and also giving some added prestige to the mission. But this mission was not funded by the Spanish government in the sense that we would understand it today as a government-funded mission. Similarly, the voyages of the people working for Henry the Navigator were not a state-sponsored thing. The state has, they were done by various prizes for private ship owners if you would sail so much farther down the coast of Africa than the last time. Much of the exploration of the American West was done by the U.S. Army and the U.S. Topographical Service, but certainly a great amount of it was done by fur trading companies and other privately funded explorers. So there was, historically, there has been quite a mix. Now, there are many people who, in their frustration over certain aspects of the NASA program, have been advocated essentially abolition of the NASA exploration program with its replacement with a private program. I do not think that that is a good idea. I think it's a very poor idea. And the proof of that is the fact that there are about 100 countries in the world that do not have significant government space agencies. And none of these have significant space exploration or development programs. A good example is Australia, where there essentially is no space agency and there is no space program, despite very broad-scale public interest. I was just in Australia, and I gave a number of talks there, and all of them were packed, actually, with much larger attendance than I would typically find in an American situation. So public interest is very high, but because the government is not involved, there is no space program. Now, that said, okay, we know how to create government-sponsored missions, or at least in a sense, if you have the requisite kind of political leadership, organize excitement around certain concepts, such as humans to the moon or humans to Mars or so forth, you can mobilize government funds and carry out a mission. And I won't dwell on that, except once again to emphasize my preparatory remarks that in suggesting ways to mobilize private capital to carry out the exploration of space, I am not, emphatically not suggesting that the existing program be scuttled. What I am proposing is that it be supplemented. Okay? Because These incentives that one can propose for private exploration and development of space are unproven as yet in their ability to actually globalize such endeavors. And therefore, you don't want to destroy the program that at least working to some extent in the hope of something else happening. You want to see what you can do to supplement it. Okay, so let me give you some examples. Okay, right now, there is no basis. Well, there is some commercial activity in space, obviously, it's communication satellites and so on, and that's all fine. But if we're talking about actually getting out into the solar system, beyond Earth orbit, okay, there is essentially no commercial basis for that in place at this time. There is no commercial basis for an asteroid exploration mission or a Mars exploration mission at this time. It doesn't exist. Now, there's two ways to make that exist. One of them, which would be truly private, would be to create a means by which extraterrestrial assets could be turned into property. Okay? Property, people have to understand something. Your house is not your house because you live in it. Your house is your house because you have a piece of paper that if you take it to the police, you can use it to get them to throw out of your house wherever you want. Okay? The fact that the structure exists doesn't make it property. Okay? That's just a thing. The fact that it is your property is a legal construct. Okay? It's an arrangement that you have between you and the police force. Okay? And you and the United States Army. Okay? Ultimately speaking. That's what defines property. Now, this is a very important notion. Let me give you an example. In the American West, at the time when people started spreading over the Appalachian Mountains in the 1790s, there were 60 million buffalo. Okay? Now, buffalo are superior meat to beef in many respects. It also has, a buffalo is also more valuable than a cow in that it can survive much better in the open, takes much less, you don't have to put it in a barn to protect it from the snow. You don't have to take care of it at all. It has this magnificent furry pelt, it's just quite valuable and so forth. And yet, they were all destroyed and replaced at great expense with cattle brought over the mountains by settlers. Why? Because the buffalo were not conceived of as being property, they were conceived of as being wildlife. Okay? If the instrumentality had existed whereby someone could put a brand on buffalo and declare these herds of buffalo that you found there to be yours, okay, poor settlers who would have to work all their lives to create a herd of 20 or 30 cattle could have instantly made themselves into buffalo billionaires. Okay, but it didn't, and that opportunity was lost. Now, we take space, okay? It's been pointed out by many people, for instance, in the asteroid belt, where there are billions and trillions of dollars worth of precious metals right now, awaiting eventual exploitation. Now, that right now has no value because it is not property, okay? It could be turned into property by appropriate legislation. For example, despite the fact that the technology does not exist at this moment to actually mine it, let's say the U.S. government was to pass a law that said anybody who sends, any private organization that sends an asteroid probe out and surveys the asteroid to some requisite level of detail, say 1 meter pixel resolution or something like that, gets the rights to mine that asteroid. You scan it, you own the mining rights. Okay, the data is publicly owned. That is, you go out, you do a comprehensive survey of this asteroid according to some specified technical specifications. You make that public, so you have added to the storehouse of human knowledge, and your return for that is that that asteroid, or the rights to mine that asteroid, becomes your property. Okay? You get a piece of paper that says so. Now, well, why is that valuable, even though you can't mine the asteroid today? It's valuable because if anybody believes that that is a possibility for the future, in other words, that if the platinum in this asteroid is at some time in the future going to be worth $10 billion, then the fact that you have the rights to that is a tradable commodity, okay, albeit at a significant discount relative to its eventual value. But it could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It could easily be worth several percent of the eventual mineable value. Now, and you don't need everyone to believe that that is so. You only need some people to believe that that is so. Now, this is in fact how North America was settled. Okay? That is, land beyond the Appalachians, land in Kentucky, in the 1600s and 1700s, might as well have been the moon. Okay? Nevertheless, speculators bought from the British Crown what they call patents on huge tracts of land in that area. Okay? Despite the fact that essentially no British allied settlers or explorers had even been there. But certain people went to the British Crown and they said, here's £1 million or something, and they get, you know, Kentucky. Or what we call Kentucky. And then what would happen is this, okay? They would then want to increase the value of that. So they sponsor a few guys to go and penetrate the mountains and go explore and come back and write descriptions of what they can see. Okay, oh, here's a Pleasant Valley by a lake, ideal place for a farming community, very rich soil, rich in game and timber, so forth. Okay, and they would further this. And they would also use their influence with the Crown or the colonial authorities to try to build a road to a pass in that direction, and so forth. And in this way, the value of this region would be increased. And then they would go to some smaller speculators and they'd say, here is 100,000 acres in Kentucky near this lake. I'll sell you that for £1 million. Okay? And the guy would buy it. And then they would further the development of the area. And eventually, sponsor a settlement, finance a group of settlers to go and settle in this valley and sell them 300-acre plantations, at X thousand pounds each. Because, see, since they owned it, they wanted to increase its value, and they did, both through sponsoring exploration and eventually development, because the more of this that occurred, the more their investment went up. And of course, using their political influence to eject the French and the Indians and do whatever else was required to create a settlement in such regions. Now, and the American West was bought and sold dozens of times before anyone ever went there. Okay? And people made and lost fortunes trading in Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee, huge amounts of land, long before settlers ever went there. Okay? But the people who held this stuff, including incidentally people like George Washington was involved in this directly. He was a surveyor who was sent into what was then called the Northwest Territories by precisely such interests in order to survey the areas and to, as part of this process of developing the region. And he also engaged in the speculation himself as one of the secondary of speculators. And this was one of the reasons, incidentally, why the closing of the Trans-Appalachian frontier by the British in the Quebec Act after the French and Indian War was one of the most direct provocations of the American Revolution. Now, what to return? If we had a law that said, you scan it, you own it, okay, you own the mining rights or some other relevant rights, then it would probably be possible, perhaps, but I think probably, to sponsor asteroid probes today, commercially, because you could probably build an asteroid probe, a la a Discovery class mission, for $50 million, and that's what it costs to make a movie. Okay, that's not an enormous amount of money in the commercial world. And if in return for that, you can acquire mining rights that are potentially worth billions someday, perhaps 50 years from now, whatever, it might indeed be possible to obtain private sponsorship for such missions. Now, if that were the case, then for no cost in U.S. government layout, for no impact on the budget, you would have hundreds of asteroid probes going out in the near future. Okay? So once again, I am not proposing that we scuttle the NASA Discovery program in order to initiate this program. But what I am saying is that if we create regimes whereby private property can be created in space on the basis of exploration, okay, where things, asteroids, can be turned into property, then indeed it might be possible for us to generate new such missions. Now, then there is another method for potentially getting private enterprise active in space, although this is quasi-governmental, and that's the notion of the prizes. Now, there's been a lot of discussion recently of an X Prize, which would be entirely privately funded to motivate a suborbital vehicle, and that's good, but it's only practical because the total outlay required to create such a vehicle is probably on the order of $50 million, which is like an America's Cup race, and people might be able to spend that much money just for the prestige of doing it. But if we're talking about motivating things that are a lot more expensive than that, we need to have cash prizes that aren't really just a trophy, but which actually would represent a profit relative to the outlay. So for example, I've advanced the notion of a series of prizes to support human exploration and development of Mars. By the way, there's an article in the New York Times Magazine that will be out tomorrow. It contains numerous inaccuracies in terms of how I describe this, so I wouldn't take anything in there as being accurate. But let me try to explain how this might work. You want to create a privately funded human expedition to Mars. Now, people have heard me talk many times, and I'll talk again on Monday, about the Mars Direct Plan, which would allow, if NASA were to do it, I believe we could get human mission to Mars, or not just a mission to Mars, but a series of missions to Mars for perhaps $30 billion or so. And that's well within the U.S. government budget, and I think we should just do it. But if you wanted to take an alternative approach, you could take the same $30 billion and allocate it into prizes, with about the first $10 billion divided into 3 or 4 prizes of several billion each for various technical accomplishments relevant to the accomplishment of the human mission to Mars, and then a $20 billion grand prize for actually doing the mission. In other words, you might have $3 billion to develop a heavy lift launch vehicle, another $3 billion to develop the system that could then throw 60 tons on trans-Mars injection, and another $4 billion to develop a system that could then soft land 30 tons on Mars. So that's $10 billion in preliminary prizes, and the pursuit of which you would create the transportation system required pretty much to carry out the Mars Direct mission. And then, once you had that, the notion of going for the $20 billion prize to accomplish a round-trip human mission to Mars would not appear as that improbable thing to do. In other words, look, everyone knows you can build a heavy lift launch vehicle. It's been done. We made the Saturn V, the Russians made the Energia. So if you have a $3 billion prize to recreate a heavy lift launch vehicle in the United States, okay, no one would view that as a fantastical endeavor. Now, $3 billion is perhaps somewhat marginal, though I think you can make a profit out of it in developing a big dumb booster, a heavy lift booster. But there's no question that you could do it, and if you did do it, okay, then winning the next prize, throwing 60 tons on trans-Mars injection for another $3 billion would undoubtedly be a rather easy thing to do. And then you'd be seriously in the black. And then to move from there, now you've got the capability of throwing 60 tons on trans-Mars injection to soft land that on Mars, 30 tons, for another $4 billion, is once again a rather straightforward proposition. And now, with that kind of system in your possession, the achievement of a Mars direct mission, A, land the return vehicle on Mars, have it fuel itself out of the atmosphere, B, throw the crew out to Mars to rendezvous with it and then return home in it, okay, that's fairly straightforward. So, such a set of prizes might work. Now, what's the advantage of that? Well, that's the same $30 billion that I believe NASA could do the mission for. Okay, first of all, there's pros and cons to both of these approaches. If you said to the U.S. government, give NASA $30 billion, let's go, you could get to Mars. And that'd be pretty straightforward. But if you did it this other way, you may or may not get to Mars, because it may be that no one takes the bait, or they may. Okay? If they don't, you haven't lost anything, because no money's been spent. On the other hand, you haven't gotten to Mars. But if they do, okay, if they do, then what do you have? Then you have an incentive in place to create a true minimum cost aerospace industry. Because the existing aerospace industry has been built upon a cost plus contracting basis. They get 10 or 11 or 12% beyond the cost of the program as profit. So the more it costs, the more they make. And that is why at major aerospace companies in this country, such as the one that I used to work for, less than 20% of the people work in the factory. Okay? The large majority of people are overhead. And indeed, overhead is their most important product because it is the basis of their profit. Now, if you had a situation, though, where you can get any profit you want, okay, it's what's left over after your expenses. Okay, it's the price minus your expenses. Then you have a driver to create a true minimum cost aerospace industry. You want to create a true minimum cost heavy lift booster, a true minimum cost trans-Mars delivery system, true minimum cost Mars landing system, and indeed a true minimum cost complete round trip to Mars transportation system. Okay? Now, B, what else would you have? You'd have private capital flowing into high technology, including into NASA. That is, if you have this prize offered, okay, then somebody like me, okay, goes to somebody like Bill Gates and says, look, here's the prize, we can do it, believe me, and somebody believes somebody and they say, let's do it. Okay, so now you got this billionaire and he's got a checkbook and he says, okay, how do we put together this mission? Where do we go for the cheapest rocket engine? Well, that would probably be a private supplier. Okay, where do we go for expertise in space life support? That's Johnson Space Center. Where do we go for the latest thermal protection materials? That's the Thermal Protection Research Group at Ames Research Center. So you go shopping around, okay, and whether it's in private industry or at a university or at NASA centers, those technical groups that have the relevant technical expertise would be subcontracted and mobilized as part of this effort. Okay? You might very well hire astronauts right out of the astronaut corps. Okay? This is actually done to some extent right now. There are various private endeavors where people subcontract into NASA, okay, to support their technology development. And indeed, you would do this on the Mars mission. So you'd have money going into NASA, but not to the bureaucracy. It would be going directly to the technical groups to support the mission. Okay? So you get a true minimum cost aerospace industry. You get money going into R&D, both government and otherwise, but into the actual R&D. Okay? And you get this mission done. Not a penny would be spent unless the mission is successful, and there could be no cost overrun, at least from the government point of view. From the point of view of the taxpayer, the cost of the mission would be indeed the value of the prizes and not a penny more. So it would not be a question of me saying, yeah, NASA, we can do Mars Direct for $30 billion and maybe it turns out to be 50. Okay? No, indeed, the cost of the mission would be the value of the prize. So that's the notion of a prize for a privately funded mission to Mars. Okay, I'm running out of time? That's good. I think it offers a lot of promise, but once again, both that and a space mining patent law and other things that we can think of to mobilize private capital for space exploration should not be seen as a replacement for the existing program, but as a way of mobilizing additional resources, mobilizing the genius of the free enterprise system to supplement and eventually be the larger part, but to supplement and increase and amplify the government-sponsored exploration program we have now. Thank you.
All right. The remainder of the session, we're going to have a panel chaired by Laur, the Executive Director of the National Space Society. We got started late, so I think we're going to run over. Unfortunately, Bob has to leave at 11 o'clock for another session.
And you should all leave for that session. No, I'm not kidding about that, because that session is the session in which we're going to present what this society is going to be doing for the next year and how we're actually going to mobilize the American population in support of an aggressive space program. And we're going to talk about the tool that we're going to give you to make that happen.
Well, I have introduced Bob Zubrin before as the Werner von Braun of our time, but I'm not even sure if Werner von Braun could have given a minute and a half notice, developed a speech like that, so, especially including the buffalo analogy, one of my favorites. Welcome, thanks for staying. I would like to, each of the panelists, for those of you who've come since the beginning, has already spoken, so we're going to open it right up for questions. I want to state my view that as we talk about the government's role in space and the differences between private and public sector activities in space, I believe this is one area where, once again, the National Space Society's view has prevailed. You've already won this argument. Over the 12 years that I've been involved in the program, NSS has won a series of arguments, again, in my view, starting out with a man versus unmanned, or as I say, human versus robotic. I don't think that's an issue anymore. Everyone knows we need both. Moon versus Mars was another big issue. I don't think that's an issue. Everyone knows we're going to the moon first and then Mars, right, Bob?
Well, we've been to the moon first, so that's been done. Now we can go to Mars.
And we also have the reusable versus expendable argument. I believe we're winning that one. And finally, we have this commercial versus public sector view. And I believe, given that we have our NASA representative here this morning telling us what NASA's current plans are in this round, that we've won this argument as well. And maybe there isn't a whole lot of discussion that will go on in this panel. However, Alan's, as I say, the most enlightened person at NASA, so maybe there's some people in there we still have to convince. With that, I'd like to open this up for questions. I'll pass the mic unless people think you can hear these. Feel free to ask a question of an individual or the entire panel. Yes?
A question for Mr. Zubrin. I was wondering whether the UN treaties and some of their language about, the common heritage and all, whether those are kind of a hindrance or surmountable.
Well, I don't believe that...
Can you all hear? Okay.
Well, the United States, of course, did not sign the Moon Treaty, which would have established a regime in which the Moon and perhaps other extraterrestrial bodies are the common heritage of mankind and therefore cannot be made into private property. That would be a disaster. But I don't believe, in other words, that there is a regime of law in place right now that precludes private property in space. Unfortunately, though, there is no regime of law that establishes private property in space. And that is something that needs to be done.
Follow up. There is a law which provides sovereignty in space. You can't, as a nation, claim any particular body in space as a consequence of the 67 treaty. And if you don't have sovereignty in space, it's difficult, not impossible, it's very difficult to come up with a regime which involves property rights in space, because for bodies, etc. Because as Zubrin pointed out, what property rights is really all about is you have a piece of paper, which means you go to the police force to enforce your rights, and can withdraw from the 67th treaty by giving a year's notice. And I think that's something we ought to consider at some point.
Alan, do you know if anyone at NASA is considering these larger legal issues and the UN issues?
Mr. Golden has asked our Policy and Plans Office to start getting that on our radar screen, but I gotta admit, it's not in the top 3 at the moment, although it's certainly in the top 10. He did bring it up again recently. So we're going to start trying to understand. I would ask for Bob and even for Chuck and some of your comments, when you talk about, you think that there ought to be agencies doing some things in this area, what agencies do you think has responsibility to develop some of this, these regulations? It's not NASA, but who do you think it is?
The way, within my understanding of the overall federal government, I think this is best done with the Department of Commerce. That you would have, I actually talked to the Office of Air and Space Commercialization about this type of issue. They didn't feel that it was their job, which I was kind of surprised at. Well, we're a policy office. If you want to do something that way, go to NOAA, which I wouldn't have thought that having a register of deeds office was part of the NOAA mission. But that somewhere within that link between NASA and the Department of Commerce, I think is where this stuff should go.
And I have one other question for Bob.
Yeah, please do.
And that is the cash prize idea. It piques my interest. Dan has in fact been talking about kind of cash prizes as well on some other areas of NASA. But I would just caution as you develop that argument that you not try to base it on the old way NASA did business. We're getting away from cost plus contracts. We're getting more into performance based, which in a way sets up some of the same objectives that you're talking about to the cash prize. And when you talk about, we want to, that there could end up being cost overruns, in the new way we're doing things, there wouldn't be cost overruns because through this program management council structure they have now, if a program goes beyond 15% of schedule or cost, it's due for elimination. So I think it's a great idea. I would just caution, I wouldn't go and try to sell it on the basis of, well, we used to do things cost plus, but we don't do it that way anymore.
Well, no, that's a good point. However, the aerospace primes have been essentially created on the basis of cost plus contracting. And as a result of that, the degree of overhead in these organizations is phenomenal. I would invite you, if you ever go to Denver and visit Lockheed Martin, okay, to make an impromptu walk through the factory at, say, 10 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon when people are supposed to be on the job. Before you do that, just take a quick look at the parking lot and you'll see 6,000 cars. And then walk through the factory and you'll see 12 people. Okay? You'll get the idea. So that if you indeed want to create low-cost space hardware, basically at this point you need to create new companies which have been organized on the basis of minimum cost from the ground up. And the prizes would facilitate that, because if someone says we're going for this prize and our profit is the prize minus our costs, and if we can do this mission for $1 billion, we're going to have a $19 billion profit. You would discover that things could really cost a lot less than you're paying for now.
And I don't disagree with that, but I'm just telling you, I do believe that's the direction the agency's already moving, is performance-based, which could hopefully then encourage new companies to develop.
Now, and let me just make one comment on this. The purpose of a Mars prize, such as I said, is not merely to have someone go to Mars, plant a flag, and perhaps, the prize can specify how many days they need to spend on Mars, how much exploration they need to do. The idea would be that you would have created a minimum cost Mars transportation system, at which point NASA could say, okay, we'll establish a Mars base. You guys can get us to Mars and back for $2 billion a crew. Well, then we can now figure out, well, this is going to cost $1 billion a year to support a Mars base, and we will be the anchor tenant on Mars, and we will buy this system to do our logistics. And in other words, that you would create minimum cost space systems, which then NASA could use as a set of tools to construct its various extraterrestrial endeavors, moon bases, Mars bases, or what have you.
Another Another question, Ransom?
It seems to me that the role of government and probably the level of government with respect to space depends to some degree on what the public wants that role to be and what the public wants the level to be. I mean, at least in a democracy, I would suspect that that's true. And it seems to me also that the space community has been particularly reactionary over the years as opposed to visionary with respect to what that public wants. And I think that if you're going to be planning out, for example, we had the NASA tell us that they're planning out to 2020. What I want to know is what are you projecting the public to want over that next 25 years, because it seems to me that as a visionary you should be trying to envision what the public is going to want. And I think that's probably more important in determining what the role of government is going to be in the future than what we've done in the past, and that is react every so many years to what we perceive to be a change in public opinion. So I would kind of want to know what you believe, or what the panel believes the people of this country are going to want over the next 20 years, and how that vision then will be change the role of government or affect the role of government.
Well, I think that's very much on the mind of the administrator when he's put such an emphasis on wanting to understand what does the public want out of its space program. He's the one that implemented some town hall meetings a few years ago. We're now cooperating with the private initiative, the Mission Home activity that Space Society's in their new set of town hall meetings they're going to have. We go out and talk and ask what the public is thinking. Our strategic plan isn't set in stone necessarily. It is providing a proposal of what might be, and we are now seeking public comment to that. But we have to hear from the public at some point, and we are trying to understand what are the forums, what are the ways you do that. And it's not an easy thing to do. The Boston, the Christian Science Monitor brought this up in an editorial by Bob Cowan after this Space Horizon Conference Chuck and I spoke at, where he was in the article encouraging people to let your congressman know. The fact of the matter is, people don't tell the leadership what they think ought to be happening in space. It's one of the least heard about issues that congressmen tell me that they hear on. So, you know, you got to do something about it. You got to pick up the pen. You got to let NASA know or your congressman know. But we've made the overture. We've asked people to come dance. We're waiting for somebody to dance with them, I guess.
Let me just comment on that. I think it's fair to say that I have done more, I believe this is true, in the recent period I've done more public speeches to more public audiences about space than anyone else, period. And I can tell you point blank what the public wants, and it's really a case of purloined letter. That is, the answer is obvious. It's been on the table for the past 25 years, and that is human exploration and settlement of Mars, and that is a fact. No, let me tell you, it is a fact, okay? It is a fact. The public,
a fact known to you that they are not making known to their elected leaders.
I'll tell you, okay, it is a fact. This has been out there. The public are not interested in watching nukes screw in zero gravity. They're not. They really aren't. Okay, they're not interested in Coke machines in zero gravity. Okay, they weren't terribly interested in the Skylab and the space station. In broad terms, in the broadest terms, what they're interested in is the human exploration and settlement of space. And having been to the moon, okay, they recognize that Mars is the next objective. And there is tremendous public fascination with Mars. And frankly, I mean, if you want to put it in very stark terms, the reason why, for instance, the Planetary Society, which has a significantly greater emphasis on Mars than this society, has 4 times the membership, is that they have been more responsive to that. But clearly, in other words, going back to the moon is like kissing your sister. Okay? There is very limited public interest in return to the moon. We were there. We were there 6 times. Okay? They want to go someplace new. Mars has been something that people have been fascinated with for 100 years, very deeply. And part of that's been based on myths associated with Mars, part of that's been based on the reality. But it is there, it is true. And when NASA fishes around and say, well, maybe we should go to asteroids, maybe we should go back to the moon, they are avoiding the challenge that has been in their face since the conclusion of Apollo. And frankly, in continuing to avoid it, you risk trying the patience of the public, because continuing to repeat things that were essentially done 25 years ago in terms of going to the moon and doing space stations, okay, and limiting operations beyond Earth orbital space to robotic probes. Okay, in other words, in continuing to repeat the tricks that you already know, you are trying the patience of the public. NASA was chartered by the American people in the late 50s and 60s to storm heaven. And in the 1960s and into the early 70s, they did exactly that. They went to the moon. It was an unbelievable thing to do, and they did it. And they sent probes, and they landed them on Mars and flew them by Jupiter and Saturn, and they did it. And it was unbelievable, new, incredible stuff. But since then, and it's not obviously not entirely your fault, I'm not saying it's not a question of NASA decision, it's also obviously a question of congressional funding. But as a result of that combination of continuing to basically do the same things, I know that there's new aspects to what is being done. Every mission in one sense or another does something new. But in the broadest terms, you're doing the same things you did 25 years ago. And that is why your budget is slipping at 5% a year. And will continue to do so, so long as you do not launch a major outward push, okay, that recognizes the fundamental imperative.
I've got to chime in on that one too. But expanding the envelope of how far are we going, the been there, done that stuff is all important. But you look at the survey work that Patrick Collins has come up with, which indicates both in Japan and in America, and a little bit of data coming in from Europe, that somewhere between 60 and 70% of the people surveyed have a personal desire to go to space for recreation and tourism stuff. That is not expanding the envelope in the physical sense, but it is expanding the economic envelope and allowing more day-to-day commercial activities to go into areas that have already been established through things like the station program. So when you have potential multi-billion-dollar markets that seem to be there with the right kind of enabling legislation, regulation, and technology transfer, that is a huge growth in potential commercial space activity and commercial space investment and tax revenues going back into the system that is there for the taking, and that needs to be worked into the agenda as well.
I know people have conflicts with the next session, so I'll just take one more question. Yeah, Jerry?
Yeah, is in fact NASA continually, even with the aspects of limited budgets, still committed to the Discover program, which I feel is, has brought up the cheaper, smaller spacecraft, which I think is one of the more brighter aspects that I've seen from NASA in the last few years. And in shrinking budgets, are they continually committed to continuing that program?
Yes, both the Discover program and the New Millennium program, which I think are the two best examples we have of the faster, better, cheaper philosophy. Discovery program just selected another couple, I believe, for that series, and we do have that on continuing funding.
Well, I guess my predictions were wrong. We did find something to disagree about. That's a positive thing. Thank you all for coming. I know, Bob, your session is not in this room. So those of you who want to hear about the NSS vision as told by Bob Zubrin can move on. I don't know what column that's in. B. And is there another program here right now? Okay. Thank you very much.
Echo.